Kribbit, the Red Toad from Maryland. Kribbit, the Red Toad from Maryland, by Lisa Downey Merriam, published by Red Toad Press, New York, New York. For Lucy and Joe, with much love. When I was little, I used to visit Uncle Lawrence's farm in the rolling hills along the Potomac River in Washington County, Maryland. Uncle Lawrence lived in an old stone house up on a bluff overlooking the river. I liked to hike up to the sheep pasture where an enormous tree had branches that hung all the way to the ground. I liked to swing on the vines hanging from the branches, my feet brushing the woolly backs of the sheep. No matter how hot the day, the shade of that tree was cool and inviting. I would swing under the tree until my Aunt Pauline rang the farm bell for lunch. I walked along the cow path down the hill back to the house, dragging a stick and kicking at the clods of red dirt. Suddenly, my eye was drawn to one clod of dirt that kept moving. I looked again, and the dirt clod jumped. It was hopping. It wasn't a dirt clod at all. It was a toad, a tiny toad, as red as the Maryland dirt. I sprung into action and caught him in my hands. He was the most beautiful creature, all red and warty with golden eyes. He was only the size of a quarter. I ran down the hill and called for Uncle Lawrence. He lit up with excitement over the tiny toad. He took me to the ice house and found a big empty pickle jar. We put the toad inside so we could examine him in detail. He was beautiful. My Uncle Lawrence said he was the finest-looking toad he'd ever seen and asked me if I had a name for him. I thought for a moment and named him Kribbit. Kribbit needs more than a glass jar to be happy, he said. We put some dirt and weeds at the bottom of the jar and placed a little bowl of water inside. Now that's a terrarium, said Uncle Lawrence. Kribbit will feel more at home if he can sit on some nice red Maryland dirt and hide under some leaves. Uncle Lawrence thought Kribbit might be hungry. We put some peanut butter out on a plate in the garden. Toads like to eat ants, said Uncle Lawrence. Let's see what we can catch. In a half hour, we had many, many, many juicy ants. Indeed, Kribbit was hungry. When he heard the ants, he became very alert. He began to slowly creep up on them. When he got close, he froze. Quicker than I could see, Kribbit's tongue shot out, and one ant disappeared into his mouth. "Can I keep him?" I asked. Uncle Lawrence said that Kribbit would be happier on the farm, but seeing how much I loved him, I could take him home to Chicago. He made me promise the minute I failed to take good care of the toad, I had to bring him back to the farm. I carried Kribbit in his pickle jar very carefully onto the plane and showed him off to the pilot. I held Kribbit's jar in my lap. The pilot announced to everyone that he would try to make the flight extra smooth because of our unusual little passenger. When I got home, my mother helped me make a terrarium, something bigger than the pickle jar. When everything was ready, we put Kribbit inside. My mother put a screen over the top and attached it with a rubber band so that Kribbit could not get out. In the middle of the night, a strange sound awakened me. I got a flashlight out of my nightstand and followed the sound. It was coming from Kribbit's terrarium. I flashed my light around, and there he was. Kribbit's throat was blown up like a bubble. He was singing a toad song. It sounded a little sad. Everything went well for a while. I fed Kribbit every day. Every night, he sang me to sleep. When I started school, I got very busy. I thought about Kribbit less and less. My mother had to remind me to feed him. One day, I forgot to put the lid on his terrarium, and I forgot to feed him. Days passed before I thought of him. I went to check on him and discovered he was gone. The terrarium was empty. No Kribbit. I looked everywhere and finally found him hidden on the second floor of my dollhouse, looking sad and hungry. My mother said a dollhouse was no place for a toad. Kribbit had to return to Maryland. When spring came, I put Kribbit in the pickle jar and flew back to Maryland. Uncle Lawrence and I carried Kribbit to the exact place where I first found him. I picked him out of the jar and gave him a last kiss. Then I set him down on the red Maryland dirt. Cribbit looked around nervously and hopped to the edge of the lane. Then he disappeared under some leaves. He was home. I was sad watching Cribbit hop away, but I knew my mother was right. He did not belong in a dollhouse or a terrarium. He belonged on a farm in Maryland. There he could sing, not sad songs to a little girl, but happy ones to other toads. I like to think Cribbit lived a long and happy life, and that his children and grandchildren still hop along the red dirt country lanes on my Uncle Lawrence's farm. And if toads could talk, he certainly would have an unusual tale to tell his friends. How many toads fly in jets? Red Toad Press. Copies of Cribbit, the Red Toad from Maryland, can be purchased at all major booksellers and directly from www.redtoadpress.com. Cribbit, the Red Toad from Maryland, is the story of a little girl who falls in love with a wild animal, a tiny red toad. After taking him home and trying to care for him, she learns that wild animals belong in the wild. She loves him enough to return him to his home. Set on a farm in the rolling hills of Washington County, Maryland, the story is lovingly illustrated with original watercolor portraits of the farm setting. Children and adults will enjoy reading the story again and again.